I'm Professor Brett Brosseit, and I direct the Department of Advanced Critical Thinking at the Ave Maria School of Law in Naples, Florida. In this brief presentation, I'll share with you the results of a study I recently conducted concerning the development of critical thinking skills in law students. Following a brief introduction, I'll explore the nature of the problem underlying the study, after which I'll walk you through the way in which the study was conducted before introducing the findings of the study, which consist of a comprehensive conceptual model of the development of critical thinking in law students, including 12 factors to optimize student performance. Legal education is in a crisis. Many college students are graduating with grossly underdeveloped critical thinking skills. These are precisely the type of skills required to succeed and excel in the study and practice of law. Now, legal scholars have termed this phenomenon the new normal, to which law schools must adjust if they are to meet the rapidly changing educational needs of today's students. Some of you may have seen the academically adrift study published by sociologist Aram and Roxa in 2011. This study hit the academy like a nuclear explosion. Aram and Roxa found that fully 45% of the students in the study experienced absolutely no measurable gains in critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing during their first 2 years of their college education, the time in which the greatest gains in critical thinking should be realized. Now, Aram and Roxa also surveyed these students to determine their future plans, and the results were astonishing. 81% of these students indicated that they plan to pursue a graduate education. So clearly there is a major disconnect between students' level of preparation for graduate studies and their ambitions to pursue such studies. Now, many of the participants in this study spoke in terms of a delusion that affects both professors and students in the academy. And because this concept of a delusion arose so frequently, I went and looked it up in the dictionary, and this is what I found. Delusion: a belief or impression that is firmly maintained despite being contradicted by superior evidence to the contrary. Typically a symptom of mental disorder. So at this point, I'm asking myself, what's going on here? Are we really, students and professors alike, under some mass delusion? And does this represent some form of a new emerging mental disorder? These days, since everybody uses websites like Wikipedia to try to define terms for newly emerging phenomenon, I took a crack at it, and I figured if we were to try to define this in Wikipedia, perhaps it might look something like this. Perhaps the term for this new mental disorder is academania. And academania perhaps may be defined as the irrational belief that students have developed the critical thinking skills required to succeed and excel in graduate studies and professional practice. So going forward, I'll try to point out to you a few places in the study where this concept of a delusion arose, and just keep in mind the possibility that we all may be suffering from academania. When Academically Adrift came out, many of us probably hoped that it represented an isolated situation, or that perhaps the study was somehow flawed in its design. Well, for better or for worse, since then, a number of other large-scale studies have largely corroborated Aram and Roxa's findings. Notably in the United States, the Wabash National Study, which has tracked the learning outcomes of over 17,000 students across the United States since 2005. Similar to Academically Adrift, the Wabash study indicates that students overall in the aggregate are experiencing only modest gains in critical thinking, and that many individual students are experiencing a lack of growth or even a decline in their critical thinking skills. Now, how one experiences a decline in critical thinking over the course of their college education is beyond me, but apparently that is exactly what's happening, at least in some instances. While all of this is going on, the Legal Academy has come under increasing scrutiny for its failure to adopt valid, empirically based educational methods and to produce acceptable learning outcomes. And there are a number of prominent publications calling for reform in the Legal Academy, a few of which I have listed for you here on the screen. Stuckey, for instance, points out that legal educators routinely ignore even the most foundational learning principles, things like identifying valid learning objectives, designing appropriate learning activities to obtain these objectives, and measuring students' progress toward the objectives. In light of all this, the American Bar Association took it upon itself this year to revise the rules governing the accreditation of law schools to provide that law schools must now establish and assess learning outcomes. Now, that's a loaded term in the academy, and it represents a seismic shift, essentially moving learning science from an ancillary role in the legal academy to a central role. At this point, then, we have a generation of students with widespread fundamental deficits in critical thinking, such that traditional law school academic support programs cannot effectively address their learning needs. And the Legal Academy is now calling for guidance in the form of empirical research to formulate more comprehensive systemic approaches to addressing this phenomenon and better meeting the needs of today's students. So the purpose of this study was to respond to the concerns regarding these deficits in critical thinking skills among law students, and to address the need for empirical research to help the Academy move toward developing an effective set of best practices to optimize student outcomes. For this study, I selected a grounded theory research methodology. Grounded theory is a rigorous form of qualitative research that is used to develop comprehensive theory of large-scale phenomenon such as the development of critical thinking in law students. The participants for this study consisted of 14 experienced law school academic support professionals at schools throughout the United States. Now, some of you who may be used to engaging in a lot of quantitative research may look at this sample size and say, wow, 14 participants, that's not many. And in the context of quantitative research, you would be correct. Qualitative research, however, is quite different. Qualitative researchers are concerned with reaching the point of saturation, which is the point at which the gathering of any new additional data will not result in the generation of any new concepts. So for this study, 14 participants was a very robust sample size, and I was able to continue data collection all the way through to the point of saturation. My primary line of inquiry in this study was to determine the perceptions of these academic support professionals regarding the development of critical thinking skills in law students, since these are the folks with in-depth experience and first-hand knowledge and insight into this phenomenon. To collect data, I conducted recorded telephone interviews with each of the participants, after which I had these recordings reduced to transcripts, and I painstakingly reviewed each line in the transcripts and assigned labeling codes to each of the concepts that I encountered. I then conducted successive rounds of coding, and using an inductive reasoning process, I sought to identify broader unifying themes among the data in order to formulate a comprehensive conceptual model of the phenomenon. What I ended up with was 4 primary categories in the model, each of which contains a number of descriptive subcomponents that give additional depth and dimension to our understanding of the phenomenon. Finally, 12 discrete factors arose that, when addressed by law schools, should help optimize students' performance and the development of their critical thinking skills. So, before I introduce the critical thinking in law students model in its entirety, it helps to have a little insight into some of the primary components. The first category in the model, student learning needs, are the areas where the widest gap exists between students' current skills and those necessary to optimize performance. So these student learning needs are what should drive the establishment and the measurement of learning objectives in law schools. You can see there are a number of key themes that appear under this category, and unfortunately, I don't have time to review each of these in this truncated format. However, Each of these themes is much more fully developed and explored in the paper underlying this study. The second primary category, student learning challenges, represent issues that impede law students from optimizing their performance. Law schools will have to put measures in place to help students address these issues if they are to proceed to optimize their performance in critical thinking. The third primary category, legal education system challenges, represent issues that impede law schools from delivering the best possible education to meet students' needs. And I'll point out here, as I promised I would, this is one of the areas where participants tended to speak in terms of a delusion. And what they were saying here is that, the application of a grading curve, which is the traditional method of law school grading, it makes it virtually impossible for students to accurately assess where they stand, particularly when it may be coupled with grade inflation. So students may look at their grades and they might see a B or a C and they might think, hey, I'm doing just great, when in fact they still may have some pretty serious learning deficiencies that, if optimized, could greatly contribute to their performance. And the participants here said that, look, if we continue to use this grading curve and we don't give students a more accurate indication of where they stand, we are part of the delusion. We are precipitating academia. So this is the critical thinking and law students model in its entirety. And you can see that the three primary categories we've introduced, student learning challenges, student learning needs, and legal education system challenges, appear around the periphery of the model, and all of them inform the central category, the 12 factors to optimize student performance. These 12 factors are divided into three primary categories: faculty-driven factors, pedagogical factors, and leadership-driven factors. The faculty-driven factors are issues that the participants believe to be largely within the control of faculty at any particular institution. Perhaps because they arise at the classroom level, they may implicate issues of academic freedom, or they may represent cultural aspects of a faculty at a particular institution. Here, participants emphasize the need for law schools and law professors to constantly maintain a student success focus, meaning that everything that every professor does needs to be focused around how can I help these students succeed, overcome these deficits, and advance in these key critical thinking areas. And participants spoke in terms of a partnership with shared responsibility where both students and professors acknowledge and understand that they both have responsibilities and obligations toward meeting these needs. Participants also emphasize, though, the need to maintain a very rigorous academic culture. Sometimes when professors aren't really sure how to help students and they're having trouble, they may have a tendency to want to simply reduce their expectations, kind of dumb down the curriculum, if you will. And maybe even grade inflation could take hold. Obviously, these things are counterproductive and simply exacerbate the underlying problems. Maintenance of a rigorous academic culture also came through as a strong theme. The provision of individual student support is another area where this delusional concept arose. And what participants pointed out here was that in the absence of individual feedback, one-on-one from a professor to a student, it's very easy for students to delude themselves into thinking that their performance is just fine. And we've all seen this maybe in some instances where due to the resources, a professor may not have the ability to sit down with every student individually, so they may perhaps post a model answer. It's very easy for students to look at that answer and say, wow, my answer looks pretty much like that. And if I would have just tweaked it a little bit to address this particular professor's idiosyncrasies, I would have aced it. When in fact that student could have some very serious underlying issues, and neither the professor nor the student will ever know this in the absence of individual feedback and support. Finally, participants stressed the need for faculty to voluntarily participate and support new learning initiatives, even though change can sometimes be difficult in the academic freedom environment. It's incumbent upon faculty themselves to decide that they're going to voluntarily support these types of new innovations and changes in the legal academy. Pedagogical factors refer to issues that are inherent in the law school curriculum. These are specific learning approaches and strategies that the participants believed would help address students' learning needs and optimize their performance. A very strong theme that came through was the need for more active learning approaches in the legal academy. And here what participants were saying is that the Socratic method, the traditional method of legal education, seldom engages all of the students in the class. And therefore, they advocated for implementing, in addition to the Socratic method, some more active learning approaches, things like collaborative learning, perhaps team-based learning, and also some problem-based learning so that students aren't just reading cases all semester, they're being able to actually work through problems and actively engage their critical thinking skills each step of the way. Professors also need to be able to provide thought process training to students, which means that they need to be able to explicitly articulate each step in their thinking and reasoning process to help students develop effective roadmaps, internal mental roadmaps for legal learning and problem solving based upon direction from their professors. They also need a consistent applied practice in a very structured way, and essay writing. Participants noted what they called a disturbing downward trend toward the use of more multiple choice questions on law school exams, perhaps in reaction to bar issues and whatnot. And while some of this may be absolutely valid and desirable, participants cautioned against the overuse of multiple choice testing, especially during the first year of law school, because in the absence of essay testing, students cannot fully exercise their analytical skills, and students and professors cannot then go back and visualize and see the steps in the student's reasoning process to help them. Finally, formative assessment and feedback came through as a very strong theme. Again, the idea that students need to have some guidance early in the semester to be able to make the necessary adjustments. If they only have one exam at the end of the semester, as is the traditional law school method, students cannot self-regulate their performance because they don't know where to make changes. But if you give them formative assessment, formative meaning assessments for learning purposes, early and throughout the semester, it enables them to make effective decisions to self-regulate their own intellectual development and progress. The leadership-driven factors were those that the participants believed to be largely within the control of the leadership at a particular institution. And they emphasized the need for strong top-down leadership because given the large-scale institutional changes that need to be made, these things are unlikely to occur organically under weak leadership. Next, they stress the need for law schools to engage in outcomes assessment at the institutional level. Here, what they're talking about is gathering student outcomes information and using it in the aggregate to help inform decisions about the curriculum to help put in place the most effective, promising approaches to helping students overcome deficits and advance their skills. And finally, participants stressed the need for a structured way of communicating promising new learning approaches and ensuring that they're integrated into the curriculum. In the absence of a structured way of doing this, it oftentimes just slips through the cracks and doesn't happen. So these 12 factors are intrinsically connected, and if implemented holistically, should result in law schools being able to help students optimize their critical thinking skills and their performance. If any of these factors are overlooked and ignored, however, it could lead to unintended consequences that may compromise results. So at this point, I would suggest that the critical thinking in law students model be implemented and that parameters be developed for its successful application, and that it be used to help formulate a set of best practices for the development of critical thinking skills in the academy. And it may also precipitate broader discussions about how the legal academy may better employ empirical research and evidence-based learning strategies. So I ask you, will you join me so that together we can cure academania once and for all? Thank you.